Hi, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we got this webinar started. We're really excited to have you here today. My name's Anna Blasco, and I'm with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And today we're going to talk about the 2017 Continuum of Care NOFA. And we're going to start off talking about a couple elements, but mainly we're going to focus on the Transitional Housing Rapid Rehousing Joint Component. And our two presenters today are Cynthia Najendra, who is the Director of the Center for Capacity Building, and Christy Schullenberg, who's a Senior Technical Assistance Specialist here at the Alliance. Can you go to the next slide, Christy? Thank you. So quick housekeeping, same old stuff that you guys already know. Your lines are on mute, but we do want to hear from you. So please feel free to type questions into the chat box at any time. We're going to try and get to some of those at the end of the webinar. If you have any particularly technical questions, we're probably going to refer you to the HUD Ask a Question tool, because we are, trying to focus on the bigger picture here today. But you can always ask us any question by typing them into the chat box or the questions box. And we're going to definitely post the webinar slides on our website, and I will send out in the chat box to all of the attendees of this webinar the URL where we will upload this webinar as soon as possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia.
Thanks, Anna. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Cynthia Najendra, and I am going to just give everyone a friendly reminder that while we at the Alliance are trying to provide some helpful information to help you really use the NOFA strategically as possible to get the best outcomes for a community as possible, we are not HUD. And so if you have very technical questions, the best place to direct them is the AAQ page on HUD's website. And we are going to just pop that link into the chat box so that you can use that and directly ask HUD any technical questions you have. Christy and I have both had the experience of writing NOFAs for different communities, and so we know so many technical questions come up, and the AAQ is usually pretty responsive, so that is really the best place for technical questions. Feel free to ask us questions, and we'll try to get to them today. We don't probably have a lot of time for questions, but the best place to go for the really technical ones are HUD. Next slide, please. Yep. So the purpose of today's webinar is really to provide an overview of the new joint component, and we are also going to go over a few of the other important highlights that we have mentioned in past webinars, because we know even though the CoC NOFA competition is underway, we know you're all very busy and right in the middle of a lot of different community processes. Communities are focused on running their competitions and writing their consolidated applications. It is still important to step back and try to reflect on how the CoC NOFA, and in particular, whether this new joint component will improve your system's response to homelessness and how you can best use it. So in today's webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about what's new and notable in this year's NOFA, and we're going to briefly touch on some other priorities that we have that are different this year than last year. Then we're going to zoom out, and we're really going to look at the bigger picture, and we're going to talk about how to figure out what your community needs to end homelessness, how to figure that out, and how to use the NOFA process to achieve that. We will provide an overview of the new project component, which is the Transitional Housing Rapid Rehousing, or PH-RRH, and how to use it strategically, and how to figure out if you really need it. We're also going to talk about what to expect from the Alliance during the competition. And Anne, I'm going to hand that back over to you to do a poll.
Great, thanks. So let's get this poll launched. So we want to just kind of check in on how you guys are feeling about the NOFA. So so we want you to hear if your understanding about the joint component will assist your CoC in ending homelessness so your understanding of how the joint component will assist your CoC in ending homelessness. Is your understanding of the joint component clear and sunny, more partly cloudy or cloudy, perhaps spotty showers or heavy rain? I think you guys noticed we have sort of a weather theme here. But we just want to check in with you guys about how clear or unclear your understanding of the joint component and how it's going to assist your CoC in ending homelessness is. I see about 65% of attendees have voted, so I'm going to wait just another second or two to get a little bit more folks to vote, and then I will close the poll and show you guys the results. Okay, looks like over 75% of people have voted, so let me share the results with you guys. So most folks, it looks like, are feeling either partly cloudy or cloudy. Very few people are clear and sunny, and I totally understand, because it's definitely very different than in years past, and it's a little confusing, the joint component. So thank you guys so much for that, and I'm going to turn it back over to Cynthia.
Thanks, Anna. So I want to just reflect on what folks have answered here. Understandably, as Anna said, you might not have a lot of clarity about the joint component because it's so new. And what we're going to try to do today is give you sort of some ways that we recommend thinking about using it. It's not every way you should use it. It's not everything about the joint component, but when we have sort of stepped back and thought about what this could be really useful for in communities and what communities need, we kind of came up with some general guidelines that we thought would be helpful to share. And this is also coming from things that HUD has said. HUD has said, put out some guidance on this. And also, this has also come from talking to communities about what they think this could be really useful for. So that's really what we're going to try to focus on today. Before we get to that, I wanted to just say that I know we use a lot of acronyms, and so this is just some of the acronyms we're going to be using today, so that you have a sense when you go back to use these slides later, we're going to post them, that you kind of have a sense for what these different acronyms are. Okay, so we'll talk for just a minute about what is new and notable in this year's NOFA, and I want to just mention that we did have a webinar that sort of fleshed this out a little bit more in June. That is recorded on our website, so feel free to go back and look at that as well. So we all know that the registration notice was released in April. I'm sure you are very aware that the applications are due September 28th. The funding available is approximately about $2 billion, and the bonus funding available, and there is bonus funding available, which is good news, which is 6% of FPRN. So here are HUD's 2017 policy priorities. They haven't changed much from previous years, but they're a little bit more concise. So the policy priorities are to end homelessness for everybody, create a systemic response to homelessness, strategically allocate and use resources, and use a housing-first approach. So as in past years, COCs must prioritize projects into tiers, with projects prioritized in Tier 1 being more likely to be funded than projects of lower priority that fall into Tier 2. We know this is a difficult process to figure out what goes into Tier 1 and Tier 2, so communities have to use a performance-based project review and rank process. In other words, to try to figure out what goes into Tier 2, it really has to be based on a very transparent and fair process that uses performance as sort of the way of looking at each project. There is a project review tool on HUD's website this year that you can take a look at. It's optional to use, but there are a lot of good ideas about how to rank projects and what objective performance criteria to use, so we encourage that you take a look at that. So now that we've touched on some of the details of the NOFA, let's step back and remember the big picture of what you are ultimately trying to achieve. And I know this is difficult, certainly when you're in the craziness of trying to organize meetings and trying to get your review and rank and trying to get projects to submit data. It's very difficult to step back and try to figure out what you're trying to achieve. So you're in a community that should have a vision for ending homelessness that is year-round. It's something you're working on every month throughout the year, and the NOFA process is really one of the many tools you have to enact that plan and achieve that vision, because it gives you the opportunity to change and reallocate projects based on performance, based on what your community needs. And so it should really be something that's sort of part of your process and your vision of ending homelessness. The added bonus here is that this will help make the NOFA process much less haphazard and much more strategic. And if you haven't started doing this already, it's never too late to start. You can start now. You can always have this, sort of ready for next year's NOFA, but it's always helpful to just start now so that you know exactly where you're headed. So here's a quick overview of what we talked about in our previous webinar in June. If you'd like to listen to that webinar again, it's on our website. Here's where we encourage COCs to do what to do when facilitating a NOFA process to reach the best possible outcomes for people experiencing homelessness in your community. So first, have a plan. HUD states in the 2017 registration notice that they expect communities to use cost, performance, and outcome data to improve how their resources are being utilized to end homelessness. So this isn't just about the competition, as I said before, or what points are available, but rather what is going to reduce and ultimately end homelessness in your community? What is going to make an impact in your actual numbers? So to secondly, focus on outcomes. To make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring, some important outcomes to focus on are reducing the number of people experiencing homelessness. Communities with a high unsheltered population should prioritize reducing unsheltered homelessness, particularly for single adults. Often single adults are the largest portion of the unsheltered population in most communities, and generally a large portion of the sheltered population as well. And many communities just don't have enough low barrier and housing focused resources for this population. So think about how you're going to use your resources during this NOFA to really focus on that big, significant population. Secondly, reduce the length of time people experience homelessness. We know that homelessness, the longer periods of time that people experience homelessness, the more negative the impacts are, and the more likely it is that they may experience homelessness again. So we want to reduce the length of time people experience homelessness within our projects and within the whole system. We want to increase exits from the homelessness system to permanent housing. So we want to make sure that we are choosing projects that are really focused on exiting the most vulnerable and targeting the most vulnerable for permanent housing. We also want to align, know what you need. So you want to make sure that you're using a data-informed process. So what does that mean? We'll talk a little bit about that today, but what you want to do is think about, once you have these outcomes to focus on, what interventions does your community need to meet these outcomes? So you want to conduct your gaps analysis. Data and project performance on the outcomes we just mentioned should drive decisions around what your community needs. COC should utilize PIT and HIC data, which you all have, and an evaluation of project performance, which you are undergoing now, and try to also include meaningful consumer input, if you haven't already, to determine your community-specific needs. So once you've determined what you need and you have outcomes to focus on, you want to align the projects with that need. So determine whether you have the right mix of projects to meet those needs you've just identified of households experiencing homelessness in your community. Look at both the supply of projects you've got and the demand on those projects from people experiencing homelessness. So for example, as I said before, you might have a high population of unsheltered people who are single adults. And when you look at your projects, you realize, well, we have a lot of projects for families. We have a lot of maybe permanent supportive housing for people who are chronically homeless, so we don't have that high a chronically homeless population. So what do we need to do to readjust our projects to really meet the need of our community? And we already have the data, the PIT, the HIC, HMIS data to really start to figure that out. Okay, so now let's think about how to use the CoC NOFA process to provide you with opportunities to actually achieve these goals. So as I said before, the CoC NOFA is really an opportunity, and I know it doesn't always feel that way, but it is an opportunity for communities in that it provides these tools to improve these outcomes of your system. It's really the sort of once-a-year chance to realign your project with your community's needs, and you want to make sure that you're taking every advantage that you can. So in past years, CoCs must prioritize projects into tiers, as we talked about, with tier 1 being more likely to be funded, and communities need to continue to have a performance-based project review and rank process, and reallocation is a really important tool to do that. So reallocation this year can be, so you can reallocate funds from other projects to the following projects. The new permanent supportive housing, which is DedicatedPlus, I'll talk about that in a second, or chronically homeless individuals and families, including youth, and also to new rapid rehousing for individuals, families, and youth up to 24. And the categories of who you can serve in that rapid rehousing project are listed here. So just a quick word on DedicatedPlus. We're not going to go into that very much on this webinar, but I just wanted to mention that this year's NOFA provides some unique opportunities to communities to solve some important issues they are facing when it comes to populations they are serving. And that's what DedicatedPlus is really about. COCs that are reallocating transitional housing projects that currently serve individuals or families who are chronically homeless will have an opportunity to serve those same households in a new DedicatedPlus project without those individuals losing the chronic homelessness status that they had when they entered the transitional housing project. In addition, a new DedicatedPlus project can serve chronically homeless individuals or families that had been admitted and enrolled in a permanent housing project within permanent housing project within the last year and were unable to maintain a housing placement, thus not requiring them to go through the experience that would have made them chronically homeless again. And last, a new DedicatedPlus project allows communities who have dedicated most, if not all, of the permanent supportive housing beds to the chronically homeless, serve those individuals who are vulnerable but not chronically homeless, and rapid rehousing is not appropriate intervention for them. But trying to find, I think HUD has listened to the community's input that there's a group of folks that are sort of falling between permanent housing, supportive housing, and rapid rehousing, and this is kind of a way to respond to that. So as I said, we're not going to talk a lot about that today, but I really encourage folks to look at this as an opportunity to serve a certain sector of folks that you might be trying to figure out how to serve best. So what we're really going to spend a lot of time today is reallocating or creating a new joint transitional housing or permanent housing, rapid rehousing component project. So you can also reallocate to HMIS, SSO for coordinated assessment, and you can also reallocate to what is being called project expansion this year. And that means that you can take funds from an existing project and you can add funds to expand an already existing eligible project to increase the number of units. For example, say you want to reduce some funds from a transitional housing project and you want to add funds to or reallocate funds to an already existing rapid rehousing project. You can do that this year through something called project expansion. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christy.
Thanks, Cynthia. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's take a minute here to turn to the Transitional Housing Rapid Rehousing Joint Component. We're hoping we can provide some clarity to all the cloudy and partly cloudy weather out there right now. So the Transitional Housing Rapid Rehousing Joint Component provides some really interesting and important opportunities to fill some gaps in your system. The new component is a combination of transitional housing and permanent housing in the form of rapid rehousing into a single project to serve individuals and families experiencing homelessness. So if you have this project, you have to offer both components to project participants. The component provides an opportunity for COCs to consider reallocating current eligible renewal projects, as Cynthia said, as well as a new bonus project to a combined transitional housing and rapid rehousing project that, for the first time, and this is really important, can give the community the ability to serve people who are in temporary housing and provide those same participants with a permanent housing exit paid for with rapid rehousing dollars. It's important to note that the joint component provides a safe place for individuals and families who are experiencing homelessness, and that it's understood by HUD to serve as crisis housing with financial assistance and wraparound services that are determined by those participants with a clear purpose of moving them quickly to permanent housing. So permanent housing and Housing First are helping to reduce homelessness in many communities across the country. However, these same communities still face a lack of crisis housing, which is probably true for a lot of folks on this call. So the joint component, when designed and implemented well, can fill these gaps and move your community closer to ending homelessness. So at a minimum, the joint component project should use a Housing First approach, one that embodies a client-driven service package which is focused on moving people quickly to permanent housing. So basically, from the get-go, unless there is a reason a participant wants to stay later, and we're going to go into what those might be, rapid rehousing is, you're working on rapid rehousing right away. They may have a temporary stay in transitional housing, but from the get-go, you're trying to move them to permanent housing. So the joint component also cannot require participants to participate in treatment services in order to receive assistance. It should be low barrier to entry. It should have low barriers to entry, and it should incorporate client choice when assisting with permanent housing identification and allows participants to choose when they are ready to exit the crisis housing portion of that project and move to permanent housing. Again, at a minimum, the joint component should provide and/or connect participants to resources that help improve their safety, well-being, and help them achieve their goals. And provider staff should be well-versed and up to speed on the myriad of agencies and organizations opportunities that can assist participants to meet that goal. The joint component should target and prioritize people experiencing homelessness who are the most vulnerable and have the highest barriers to access and ability to maintain their permanent housing. So for communities with large unsheltered populations and those experiencing chronic homelessness, outreach is going to be key to ensuring that the joint component is serving those who need it most. And last, the joint component should ensure that stays in the crisis housing portion of the project are brief and again are without preconditions, and that participants within that client-centered case management are working to move quickly to permanent housing. So the communities that should consider the joint component are those communities with large numbers of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, that lack crisis housing capacity, that lack strategies to exit people into permanent housing quickly. So you might have a system that can bring people in quickly, but there's no plan or no flow within the system to move them out. And so this should be a consideration. And then for communities whose shelter stays are which is designed to meet their needs, while at the same time is intentionally focused on working to move them quickly to permanent housing. And then once they're in permanent housing, the supportive services are focused on helping them maintain their housing, and that's that rapid rehousing case management component. So it should be noted that supportive services might look different for youth, and some youth may need slightly longer lengths of assistance in the crisis portion component of the project, but the key is that the participant in the project chooses when they want to move to permanent housing, not the program. So so one vision of what that might look like is a youth comes in, you might have different, they may have different service needs, but they may have a slightly longer stay in the crisis portion, but from the get-go, you're using those case management skills and motivational interviewing and those types of skills to begin them thinking about what is their housing plan to move quickly into permanent housing with rapid rehousing as a resource to do that. So for communities that currently have transitional housing projects for youth or otherwise that are not able to provide participants with financial resources to obtain permanent housing, the joint component should be considered as an opportunity really to overcome that particular hurdle. Most important, and we want to stress that for any community that finds that they have high rates of unsheltered youth homelessness, you should consider, before considering applying for the joint component, whether lowering barriers to your current projects and increasing rapid rehousing resources would actually better serve the needs of those youth and ensure just overall better use of resources. For those communities with no emergency shelter or crisis housing options available for individuals and families fleeing domestic violence, the joint component is meant to provide survivors a safe and supportive temporary housing option while working to connect them to safe permanent housing, and then provide those continued services once they're in permanent housing, again, when the participant is ready to make that move. So again, like transitional housing for youth or other transitional housing projects that have struggled or are unable to provide participants with the financial resources to obtain that permanent housing, this is where the joint component really is an opportunity to create that flow and exit out to a permanent housing alternative. So supportive services likely will look different for survivors of domestic violence and are more focused on safety planning under the joint component. And this is an example where survivors may need a slightly longer length of stay due to safety in that crisis housing portion of the project. But again, the important point here is that the participant chooses when they're ready to move to permanent housing and not the program. So they may need a slightly longer stay, but again, from the very beginning, we're working to develop that housing plan to move them to permanent housing as quickly as possible. Like youth providers, we encourage COCs and project applicants to consider what barriers to access might exist right now and how to lower those in order to create more immediate access to those projects, and whether or not rapid rehousing, an increase in rapid rehousing resources might be better to serve their needs. So is the joint component right for your COC? If yes, then the COC project applicants and key stakeholders should consider the needs of the populations within their communities that would be best served by this component, and then design the component accordingly. So this would include thinking things through like length of assistance, what kind of wraparound services would we include, and what other mainstream resources does the community need to leverage in order to be able to provide the services that would be needed under both a transitional housing and a rapid rehousing project. Last, COCs and applicants who apply for the joint component need to develop performance benchmarks, and these benchmarks should be tied to helping improve the entire COC system's performance. So when the COC is establishing and the applicants are establishing the performance benchmarks, they should be appropriate for the project's target population, and projects should be encouraged to prioritize those who are unsheltered, who have experienced long or multiple episodes of homelessness, have high barriers to exiting homelessness, and are more likely to be a victim of violence or harm. So when establishing those benchmarks, you also want to be considering how quickly will participants move into permanent housing? What are the benchmarks that you're going to set for that? How will the project accommodate people with a variety of needs? If we're serving a population with that is difficult to house, then what do housing configurations look like? What are service needs? What to do about pets, personal belongings? And how well will the project connect participants to resources in the community, which will be key in helping the household maintain their housing. So education, mainstream benefits, and employment. So benchmarks around all of those things closely tied into the system performance measures for the COC are a guide to establishing your performance benchmarks. So I'm going to move on to what to expect next from the Alliance, and we're going to close the section of the joint component because we understand that there are probably a significant amount of questions, and we want to leave time for that. So up next from the Alliance, we're going to, we have a few more blogs that will be posted in the next 2 weeks. So one on the joint component itself. We're going to have a blog focused on serving youth with the Transitional Housing Rapid Rehousing Joint Component, and also domestic violence survivors and the joint component. In addition, like last year, the Alliance has put together a 2017 HUD COC scoring criteria summary. You will find that actually in the handouts portion of this webinar in the little navigation bar that pops up in your on your screen. You'll find it under handouts, should say 1 of 5. You can download it there, but I believe Anna will also put the link for it on our website, and that's to help you kind of get a sense of what your estimated score might be. So that is available as well. So Anna, I think there are probably some questions, so we will open it up now.
Yeah, so I think Cynthia, you were also kind of taking a look at some of the questions, so feel free to jump in with any that you thought were good. But I'm going to just take a minute here to pick some questions that we're going to respond to, so feel free to type them in, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. So, so here's one that is kind of a question about transitional housing that's funded by private funds, so not Continuum of Care funds. So, you know, for communities that do have transitional housing that's privately funded and doesn't receive COC funds, and they've decided, you know, that they want to reallocate this based on their performance data, how can the COC kind of address that outside of the, you know, NOFA process, because they can't be reallocating it. And they're also wondering, will they be penalized if there's transitional housing programs in their community, even if they're privately funded?
Christy, I can start taking this, and I'm sure you can jump in. So it sounds like, if I understand the question correctly, there is a transitional housing project or a few transitional housing projects that are privately funded that don't take COC funds. The question is, I think the question, so on the one hand, if a transitional housing project only has private funds and doesn't have COC funds, no, they're not part of the reallocation process. So what you could do, and what we often recommend the communities do, is to talk to all funders in a community that are funding projects that are serving people who are homeless, and try to align all funders around the same outcomes. So if you have private funders that are funding certain things in transitional housing projects, and you want them to understand why you're funding, your COC is sort of trying to fund certain kinds of outcomes or certain kind of projects, help to kind of bring them on board and just let them know, look, we're actually, you know, trying to fund housing first projects, and this is because this is based on our data-informed need. We're showing that people really need this kind of project. So sometimes that can help funders really understand what they should and shouldn't be funding. So if this project has private funding and COC funding, you can reallocate the COC funded portion to a different kind of component. It can get a little complicated if what you're trying to do is just change that particular transitional housing project versus starting a whole new project. So I think you have to think about, well, are we just trying to change our project? If it's privately funded, you might be able to do that on your own without doing any reallocation. And if you are trying to start a new project, or trying to, you know, for that project to sort of, say, start a transitional housing, rapid rehousing part of their project, they could probably add that on, or try to figure out how to do that separately. So I know that's a little confusing, but it's hard to know exactly what's happening when I don't know the project. The thing I do want to say, though, is that HUD is not going to, quote unquote, sort of penalize if you have a transitional housing project that is privately funded. However, what you want to think about is your overall system performance measures. What HUD is going to be looking at, and what HUD in the future certainly, is those system performance measures that you have submitted into HDX about a month ago that show things like average length of homelessness in your community. Well, if you have transitional housing projects serving people who are homeless in your community, that is going to add on to your general average length of homelessness in your community. And what you're wanting to do is really reduce the amount of time people are homeless. Now, that transitional housing project might be serving a very small population that might need transitional housing. So you want to think about, well, what are the needs, and balance that with what are we trying to what are our outcomes, and what are we trying to make sure that we get to with our whole continuum of care. So there's a few things you really have to balance. Sorry, I know that was kind of a complex answer, but if you have more questions about this, you can feel free to sort of email us, I think, offline, and we can try to talk through it. Christy, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive.
Okay, so thank you, Cynthia. So bringing it back to the joint component, one of the participants would like to know if there's a suggested length of time for the transitional housing part of the joint component, a suggested length of stay in that part of the project.
Cynthia, I'll take a stab at this and then correct me if I'm wrong, but I think because HUD is thinking about the transitional housing component, transitional housing portion of the component as crisis housing, then I think we would encourage folks to be looking at what is HUD's benchmarks for crisis housing now, which is basically 30 days. So as quickly as possible is what we would encourage. So a lot of folks are leaving shelter within 1 to 7 days. Many people leave shelter within 30 days. So I think a safe benchmark for that would be 30 days. Cynthia, do you think that that's incorrect?
Yeah,
I mean,
I want to say, Yeah, I want to just say, like, you know, as I said before, we're definitely not HUD, and we don't have, I mean, I think those are good recommendations. I think the way we want to think about, the way we would recommend thinking about this is looking at your, you know, looking at your community and deciding the transitional housing part of this transitional housing rapid rehousing component can sort of be what you think that that is needed. But let's say you have a transitional housing project, a new PH-RRH Joint Component project, and you have people coming in that only need the rapid rehousing part. So that's completely okay. That project can serve just people who need rapid rehousing. It is a project that needs to be able to have people be in the transitional housing or crisis housing component, but you can go ahead and right away serve people in rapid rehousing. If you need someone to be able to stay in the crisis housing or transitional housing component for a longer period of time for various reasons, say that you have a survivor of domestic violence that is waiting for a protection order to come through, and they need some time to stay in that facility, to stay in your project, then they might need, you know, however many weeks or months that takes. Now, you might just need some time to find housing. You're in a really tight housing market, and there's someone who just is going to need a couple of months to get their documentation together, and so they might be staying there for a longer period of time. You might have, you know, some folks who really just choosing to stay there for a slightly longer period of time. However, you want to sort of keep that that crisis housing part limited, because again, we're thinking about that overall average length of homelessness in your community, and that should really, we don't want to be lengthening the time that people are homeless. We want to be making sure that period of homelessness is short, rare, brief, and we want to. So it's really about kind of what the client chooses. Client choice is really important here. So it's not the program saying, okay, the transitional housing project portion of this is X amount of days or X amount of months. It's the client saying, okay, I choose to stay a little bit longer or a little bit shorter, and I want to get housed, you know, I want to be in the rapid rehousing component immediately. Let's start looking for housing. I'm going to stay in the transitional housing component until I can move into permanent housing. So that's kind of a way to think about it.
Okay, so I have a question here that I think is fantastic. So here's how it goes. I'll just read it. The more I read and hear about this, the more I think that this is HUD CoC funding for low barrier housing focused emergency shelters and adding rapid rehousing for them to get people out faster. There seems to be no difference between how this component describes the transitional part of the joint component and how low barrier housing focused emergency shelter is described. Am I missing something?
So I want to be really clear. HUD is not calling this shelter, and HUD is not calling this, you know, this is not, the CoC funds are not for shelter. However, the Alliance is saying that you can use this as transitional housing, rapid rehousing, joint component. You can use it in the way you might be using low barrier housing focused shelter. So you're not missing anything. I think that I just want to be really, really clear that HUD is not calling this shelter, and that we are saying that this is a really good way to increase crisis capacity in your community. If you are, most communities don't have enough shelter. I know most communities on the West Coast don't have enough shelter, and they're having a sort of a higher unsheltered population. So this is a good way to sort of bring permanent housing capacity, the rapid rehousing component, to as well as crisis housing capacity. So now you have an exit plan for people in your crisis housing, and you have more crisis housing.
So Christy, I'll direct this one towards you. So this CoC says they've seen a recent uptick in families who are unsheltered, and they're wondering if this would be an appropriate, if you might think that the transitional housing rapid rehousing joint component might be appropriate for their community.
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, just the way that a rapid rehousing project, even on its own, would provide them an opportunity to move into permanent housing as soon as possible. So I think an uptick in family homelessness, if you don't have, if you lack capacity for family shelters, or you don't have any family shelters, then I think that the joint component is a good is something that the community should look into. I mean, I think if assuming you're looking at all of your data and utilization, and you have looked at the programs and projects that are currently serving families to ensure that they're housing first and low barrier to entry, assuming you've done all of that, and the community in looking at its data and its portfolio of projects sees this as a need, then I think that this would be a component that might work for you.
Anything you want to add to that, Cynthia?
No, I think that's good.
So for folks who are asking about whether or not the slides will be posted online, absolutely. We're going to post them on our website, which is endhomelessness.org, and we'll also email you guys that link when the webinar is completed. So did you guys have any other questions that you saw? I'm looking for another one. There's a lot of questions here, but I'm trying to find ones that are a little different than we've already asked.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch that are kind of detailed, sort of technical that I've been trying to answer, and some of these I think are good questions for HUD. I think we've gotten to the overall questions pretty well. There is one question here that said, I wanted to say, so how will transitional housing, rapid rehousing, the joint component participate in coordinated entry? Seems like these folks bypass coordinated entry, and I want to make it really clear that anyone who's CoC funded does not bypass coordinated entry. This would function in the exact same way that any of your CoC funded projects were in terms of participation. They have to participate in coordinated entry. And in fact, hopefully the joint component will give coordinated entry some more flexibility. So I know a lot of coordinated entry systems are trying to figure out how to include all projects, including shelters, which are not CoC funded, because they often need to be able to provide shelter to people while people are waiting for a permanent housing program enrollment. And so the PH-RRH component might be a really nice way to have some flexibility around low barrier crisis housing, as well as a rapid rehousing exit. So actually, I think it could be really, it could really enhance our ability to do coordinated entry well.
Okay, so here's another question. So this person's kind of wondering about how to make this services in a program voluntary that is trying to have a short length of stay. So they say, any ideas of how to move clients to permanent housing when we don't require case management, and those who would stay on assistance for long periods of time? Clients will not choose to move out without a time limit. Any ideas?
So I think we get this question a lot because we talk about having voluntary services in any of the sort of permanent housing projects that we, from rapid rehousing to permanent supportive housing. What voluntary services means is that you're not mandating that people participate in your services to get housed, right? That's a housing first approach. We're not having sort of requirements around that. However, it doesn't mean that case managers aren't being extremely proactive with clients. I know this is something that a lot of programs struggle with, that they're going to be folks who you feel it's the mandated services that are requiring them to participate, and that's why they're participating. Without them, people won't participate. I think, and you and I have said this in rapid rehousing trainings before, that if a program makes its services meaningful to people, people will use them. And I'm not saying that there aren't people out there who are trying really hard. Motivational interviewing is a really important technique in trying to help meet people where they are. And so motivational interviewing is something we always recommend that programs try to train their staff in and try to use, because you're working with folks who are in different stages of change. They might be all the way on the sort of pre-contemplation. In other words, I don't know that I want to be housed. I'm not sure where I am with my sort of stages of where I want to go, and some people who are really, really ready to move on. So I think it requires some training on the part of staff to engage clients proactively, even though you're not requiring and saying, hey, you have to be at one case management meeting a week or whatever it is. You're still proactively making sure that people are working on a housing plan and people are moving along to meet the goal of being housed and sustaining housing. So I think that engaging people where they are means being very proactive and having lots of techniques to engage folks. I don't know, Anna or Christine, do you have anything to add to that?
No.
I would add, landlord recruitment is a core component of rapid rehousing, and I think the Alliance would probably recommend that anybody who is going to reallocate to this program or applies for bonus funding for this type of program, the rapid rehousing portion should still follow the core components of rapid rehousing, and that means being really proactive about landlord engagement, being really focused, your housing case management really focused on, your case management is really focused on housing, your services are really focused on housing, and so you're still doing all of those things that you would do in any rapid rehousing program to help people start thinking about housing right away and identify those housing units for people as, you know, so that they can move to them as soon as possible. Okay, so we still have a little bit of time left. Do you guys want to answer more questions?
Sure.
A couple more.
Yeah, okay, great. So let's see. So someone wants to know if the NOFA is open to balance of state COCs. The answer is yes, that's easy.
Mm-hmm. Also, I see a question here. Can participants use the rapid rehousing? We said this, but I just want to make sure it was said again. Can participants use the rapid rehousing portion of the joint component without a stay in the crisis housing part? Yes, that's correct. You don't have to go into the transitional housing component of the project. The project has to be able to offer both.
We also had
actually. Yeah, and I just wanted to make, I see that, that someone has, and I should have mentioned this in my answer about voluntary services, that HUD does have a case management monthly requirement for rapid rehousing programs, that programs must require program participants to meet with the case manager at least monthly. So I don't want to contradict that at all, but there is I know HUD does have requirements for certain projects.
The other thing I want to add too, I don't know that there's a question here, but when in reading the NOFA, we didn't go into the criteria for the new bonus projects or the reallocation projects, but I think for communities that are thinking about reallocating their current transitional housing projects to a combined joint component project, but are maybe concerned about the fact that they have to close that program. Just to note that in the new rapid rehousing projects that would be created out of reallocation or the bonus, they are able to serve homeless individuals and families, including unaccompanied youth, who meet a handful of criteria, but one of them is residing in the transitional housing project that was eliminated in this competition. So that's, I think HUD is, has been hearing communities say, the difficulty of making the hard decision of potentially closing a transitional housing project, and then what happens to those clients. But those clients are eligible to be served in a new rapid rehousing project.
So I think that's a great point, Christine. It kind of leads to another question that I just saw, and I'll ask you guys this and then we can wrap it up. So, somebody wants to know kind of what is the advantage of dedicated plus beds? They say we're following HUD's prioritization for permanent supportive housing. It seems like many of the eligibility criteria for HUD's prioritization of permanent supportive housing are covered. So it sounds like this person might be a little confused about the prioritization notice that encourages DOCs to prioritize people based on for permanent supportive housing based on various different criteria and dedicated plus. So just in short, what is the advantage of dedicated plus? Why might a community want to designate some of their permanent supportive housing as dedicated plus?
Well, I think there are a couple of benefits of the dedicated plus project. I think HUD is looking at ways to, again, fill some of the gaps in these that communities are facing. So if you have the prioritization notice, and say like you're a COC that's dedicated, all of its PSH is at this point is either new PSH that can only serve chronically homeless folks, or you've dedicated the rest of your PSH beds to chronically homeless. If that's the case, then at least you have an opportunity to go to the second criteria of the prioritization notice, which is to who are those vulnerable populations that don't meet the chronically homeless definition. So the dedicated plus, it allows for that. Also, I think that it also provides an opportunity. Again, it's actually another place that provides an opportunity to serve individuals who are transitioning out of a transitional housing project that is being eliminated in this competition. So helps folks to look at, is permanent supportive housing something that this person needs, and the Dedicated Plus would allow you to move people into permanent housing bed if they were not chronically homeless. So I think I'll just go with those two. I don't know, Cynthia, if you have anything else you want to add.
No, I think that's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I've heard this explained by some folks at HUD is that, you know, there are lots of very vulnerable, very ill people who may not meet the criteria for chronically homeless. And this is kind of, you know, an understanding that those folks might need a permanent supportive housing bed, but may not meet the kind of more restrictive criteria for chronic homelessness as well. So I think that's great.
Right.
So anyway, thank you guys so much. There's a lot of questions here. There are much more than we were able to answer today, but we're going to look at all of these when we post our different resources over the coming weeks about the NOFA. So go to endhomelessness.org for those. And I just want to thank all 530 of you for waiting till the very end. So thank you guys so much.